Matthew 7, verses 24 through 29 will be our text today. I'll teach on verses 28 through 29, but I'd like to read it beginning at verse 24. Our Messiah says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a sensible man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the rivers rose, and the winds blew and pounded that house, yet it did not collapse, because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the rivers rose, the winds blew and pounded that house, and it collapsed, and its collapse was great." When Yeshua had finished this sermon, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, because he was teaching them like one who had authority and not like their scribes. May Yahweh bless his word to our hearts this day. So that's the end of our Messiah's sermon here, the Sermon on the Mount. If you look down to chapter 8, in the very next verse, it says that he came down from the mountain. He's been on the mountain since chapter 5, verse 1. The entire section is one complete sermon. When he finished his teaching, the crowds were astonished. Some Bibles say that they were amazed at his teaching. And then we're told why. It says, because he taught with authority and not like the scribes. Now, this authority doesn't mean he was loud or forceful, like he was shouting at everybody. He wasn't a 20th century televangelist. He wasn't a televangelist hollering for people to give them their money. Matthew 5:1 even says that he sat down and taught. He didn't even stand up. The authority that he taught with is best seen in the contrast that's given in the text. He taught with authority and not like one of the scribes. We see the word scribe or scribes in the New Testament. It comes from the Latin language, our English word scribe, and it means to write. Its use in the Hebrew Bible, the word is sephar. It's translated scribe or scribes. It has to do with a telling or a recounting of something. The idea is to remember something with words. Think of the word describe. I'm going to describe something to you. Or to remember something with words, or to remember something by writing it down. Some uses in the early Bible of the word sephar or scribe is where Abram is told to count the stars in Genesis 15. It's the word sephar. Count them. In Exodus 18, verse 8, Moses told his father-in-law Jethro all that had happened in Egypt. That's the word sephar, scribe. Or in Leviticus 15:13, where a person is cleansed of an issue and they number 7 days after their cleansing. The word number is to scribe, to sephar. The idea in all of these, and you could go through all of them, is a telling or a recounting of something, either verbally or writing it down. So as you keep reading in the Bible, your wisdom about scribes and what they do elevates, and you'll see that the kings had scribes. I could give many examples of this, but two are in 2 Samuel 8 and 1 Kings 4, David and Solomon. Both of them had a scribe, or scribes plural. The King James Version uses the word scribe in those texts, but the HCSB uses the word court secretary, and that's fine too. Either one is fine. The secretary for the king was one who kept a record for the king. It's interesting in 2 Kings 22 that we find that King Josiah's scribe, Shaphan, was the one who read the book of the law out loud. Remember when they discovered the book? It was hidden. They discovered it, and when Shaphan the scribe read it to King Josiah, he tore his robe because he knew that they had not kept the law. It's a lot different than today. We got preachers that dress in fancy suits and tell you don't keep the law. King Josiah tore his clothes when he heard the words of the law because the nation had not been observing the law. This is the first time in 2 Kings 22 where a scribe is connected specifically with the Torah. Now, as with many words, we do word studies, we have to understand that words develop over time. At the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, after the Babylonian captivity, the word sephar, once again Hebrew for scribe, it takes on a more significant, detailed meaning. It begins to refer at this point to the writing out, the study, and the teaching of the Torah. Now, the best place to go here is the book of Ezra. I'm going to turn here. Once again, Ezra chapter 7, verses 6 through 10. If you read Ezra 7, 1 through 5, you'll find that Ezra was a Levite. He was of the tribe of Levi, and it actually lists his genealogy all the way back to Aaron through Eleazar. So Ezra could prove his genealogy, thus he was a legitimate Aaronic priest after the Babylonian captivity. In Ezra 7, verse 6, it says this. It says that Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a scribe, Safar, skilled in the law of Moses, or Moshe, which Yahweh, the mighty one of Israel, had given. Now, this is one of many texts to prove that the law of Moshe is the same thing as the law of Yahweh. Notice the law of Moshe, which Yahweh had given, right? So it's not two separate laws. The king had granted him everything he requested because the hand of Yahweh, his mighty one, was on him. Some of the Israelites, priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and temple servants accompanied him to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month during the 7th year of the king. He began the journey from Babylon on the 1st day of the 1st month and arrived in Jerusalem on the 1st day of the 5th month. The gracious hand of his mighty one was on him because Ezra had determined in his heart to study the Torah, the law of Yahweh, to obey it, and to teach its statutes and ordinances in Israel. This is an outstanding record of Ezra the scribe, his dedication. And nothing is negative. Nothing negative is said about Ezra being a scribe. It's all positive. As a matter of fact, twice it said that the hand of Yahweh was on Ezra. And I take that to mean that Yahweh was working and active in Ezra's life. So Ezra 7 verse 10 is a refrigerator verse because Ezra had determined in his heart once again to study the law of Yahweh, to obey it, and teach its statutes and ordinances in Israel. May Yahweh raise up more Ezras to us today. The main point here is the association of the word scribe with the study and the teaching of the law. Ezra was skilled in the law. He devoted his whole life to study, obey, and teach the Torah. That's noble. That's not something to just brush off and dismiss. That's not Ezra wasting his time. Like some people have told me in our day and time, Ezra is using his time wisely. He is storing up treasures in heaven, and he will be great at the resurrection of the righteous. Praise Yahweh for Ezra. From here we can move on to a description of the scribe in the book of Sirach, sometimes called an apocryphal book. It was written around the 2nd century BC. Now, most people don't have the book of Sirach in their Bible. I don't have it in my HCSB. I do have it in the Bible there in my briefcase, but you have to listen. You can check this out if you have an apocrypha at your house. This is Sirach 38, verse 24, and then 39, 1 through 11. Listen carefully. It says, "The wisdom of a scribe depends on his opportunity for quiet. For when he has little business, he will be made wise." Anybody that studies the Bible or for a sermon, Brother Arnold could probably testify, Brother TJ, Brother Jerry, you get more accomplished as a scribe, as a student of the Scriptures, when it's quiet. The wisdom of a scribe depends on his opportunity for quiet. I get up early every morning to study. My mind is clear, my mind is focused, and I study the Scriptures, and that's how we're made wise. 39 verse 1, "How different is the man who devotes himself to the study of the law of the Most High. He will seek out the wisdom of all the ancients and be occupied with their prophecies. He will preserve the discourse of notable men and penetrate the subtleties of parables. He will seek out the hidden meanings of proverbs and be engaged in the riddles of parables. He will serve in the midst of great men and will appear before rulers. He will travel through the land of foreign nations and test the good and evil among men. He will give his heart to rising early before the Lord who created him, and will make supplication to the Most High. And he will open his mouth in prayer and make supplication for his sins. If the great Lord wills, he will be filled with the spirit of understanding. He will pour forth words of his wisdom, and in prayer he will give thanks to the Lord. He will direct his counsel and knowledge aright, and he will reflect on his hidden things. He will reveal instruction in his teaching and boast in the law of the Lord's covenant. Many will praise his understanding, and it will never be blotted out. His memory will not disappear, and his name will live through all generations. Nations will proclaim his wisdom, and the assembly will proclaim his praise. If he lives long, he will leave a name greater than 1,000. And if he goes to his rest, his work is completed. That's Sirach 38:24 and 39, 1 through 11. Excellent, positive words for the scribe. But take special note that the scribe is one who devotes his time to studying and obeying the law. And then he reveals the divine instructions in his teaching. Now, what do I talk about all this? This is the backdrop to the word scribe and scribes when we get to the Gospels. If we do not know this and we just start reading Matthew, we see the word scribe like in Matthew 5:20 and here in Matthew 7:29. We wonder, what is a scribe? Well, a scribe at the time of Yeshua was somebody who devoted their time to the study, the practice, and the teaching of the Torah. Now we might wonder, well, why do we get a negative description of the scribes in the Gospels? In Matthew 5 verse 20, Yeshua says, unless your righteousness surpass or go beyond the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 7:29, it says that Yeshua taught with authority and not like the scribes. Why do we get a negative description of the scribes? Well, there's nothing negative about Shaphan that read to King Josiah. There's nothing negative about Ezra or in the book of Sirach about a scribe. And we often miss that there are positive examples of scribes in the Gospels as well. So all the scribes weren't bad, just like all the Pharisees weren't bad. I remember there were some good Pharisees too, Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea. So there were some good scribes as well. In Matthew 13, after Yeshua finished teaching through parables, he says to his audience in verse 51, have you understood all these things? And they answer, yes. And he then says, therefore every scribe, HCSB says student of the scriptures, but literally is scribe. Every scribe instructed in the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who brings out of his storeroom what is new and what is old. That's a positive text about a scribe out of the mouth of Messiah. Albert Barnes, a Presbyterian commentator in the 1800s, states this on that particular verse. He said it really good, so I thought I'd just quote him. He says, quote, a minister should be like the father of a family, distributing to the church as it needs, and out of his treasures bringing forth truth to confirm the feeble, to enlighten the ignorant, and to recover and guide those who are in danger of straying away. End of quote. That's a positive use of scribe in the Gospels. Another one is in Matthew 23. Now, I say Matthew 23 and people think, well, that's where Yeshua said, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. He did. But he also said this in verse 34. In the midst of his rebuke, he says this. To the scribes and Pharisees he's rebuking. He says, I am sending you prophets, sages, and scribes. This is the Messiah. He's sending out these prophets, sages, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will flog in your synagogues and hound from town to town. So these scribes that Yeshua sends out are righteous. They're not the ones he pronounces the woe on. Let me mention also in passing that it was also a scribe who approached Yeshua in Mark chapter 12, and he asked him, Master, what's the greatest commandment in the Torah? And after their discussion with one another, Yeshua told that scribe, you're not far from the kingdom of Elohim. And not far from the kingdom means that you're close to the kingdom. So Yeshua was applauding this scribe for his wisdom. All of this brings us to how scribes would teach. When a scribe expounded upon the law, he would often bring up a previous or older scribe to authorize what he was saying. He would comment, a scribe would comment on a particular commandment in the Torah, and then he would say something like this. You know, Rabbi Hillel said, or Rabbi Ezra said, Rabbi Shammai said, and then he would give authorization for what he was teaching. So a scribe's teaching was generally based on the backs of previous scribes and teachers of the law that came before that particular present-day scribe. When Yeshua gives his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, he does not do that. He does not say Rabbi Hillel said. He does not say Rabbi Ezra said. As a matter of fact, he says, you've heard that it was said, but I say unto you. You've heard that it was said stands for, this is the way the scribes and teachers of the Torah have interpreted this particular commandment. But I say unto you is, this is the right way to interpret it. So he's contrasting not the law of Moses with the new law of Christ, as some people think. He's contrasting the interpretation of the law by the scribes and Pharisees as a majority versus the interpretation or proper understanding of the law by him. He ends his sermon by telling his listeners what? We read it momentarily ago. He says, you got to listen to me and do what I say. You'll be like the wise man who built his house on the rock. But if you listen to me and don't do what I say, you'll be like the foolish man that built his house on the sand. He does not appeal to previous scribes. He speaks with authority. That's why the crowds were amazed, because they were used to the scribes teaching, appealing to previous gone by scribes, and they were astonished because he just spoke directly with authority. I tell you this. You listen to me. You do what I tell you to do. He didn't teach like the scribes, so the crowds were like, this is not normal. This is not how we are normally used to being taught. This is one of the reasons why Yeshua is the prophet like Moshe. Now we call him Moses. That's not his name. The same thing that happened to get the name Jesus happened to get the name Moses. So instead of saying Moses, I'm going to try to say Moshe for the rest of this sermon. And I think that it's not too much different. You'll know who I'm talking about when I say Moshe. But out of respect for the great prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, we'll call him Moshe. That's what all the Israelites called him when he walked this earth. You can compare Deuteronomy 18. Brother TJ brought this up in his last sermon. You can compare Deuteronomy 18 verses 18 through 19 with Acts chapter 3 verses 20 through 23 to show that Yeshua is the fulfillment of the prophet like Moshe in Deuteronomy 18. Now, I've had people get upset with me for saying this, and I always wonder if they've read the Bible because this is what the Bible says. I didn't make this up last night. I recently had a debate with a fellow, and the topic of the debate was, did Paul, Saul of Tarsus, who was also called Paul, did he remain Torah observant after he converted to believe in the Messiah? Of course, I took the affirmative, and this particular fellow took the negative. He thinks that we don't go by the law of Moshe, but that we go by the law of Christ, and he thinks it's different than the law of Moshe. You can watch that debate on YouTube there. And he kept telling me this, Matthew, if the Messiah teaches the same law as Moses, how is he greater? How is the Messiah greater than Moses? He teaches the same law. To him, the Messiah being greater than Moses means that the Messiah had to teach a different law than Moshe taught. Now he kept bringing up to me Hebrews 3 verse 3 where it says, this man, speaking of Yeshua, is worthy of more glory than Moshe. He kept bringing that verse up. And, of course, it's a Bible verse, so I'm not going to disagree with it. I believe that verse. I believe that Yeshua is greater than Moshe. He is the apostle and high priest of our confession, Hebrews 3, verse 1. But I kept bringing him back to Deuteronomy 18 and Acts 3, the prophet like Moshe. And for some reason, they don't like that statement. He's the prophet like Moshe. He's the prophet like Moshe. He's the prophet like Moshe. Yet, he's worthy of more glory than Moshe. Now, like Moshe has to do with the teaching, I'm going to present to you, I'm going to suggest today, that it has to do with the teaching of Yahweh's commandments. Because in Deuteronomy 18, Yahweh speaks to Moshe and says this, I will raise up for them, Israelite community, a prophet like you, Moshe, from among their brothers. And then he explains, I will put my words, this is Yahweh speaking, I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. So if Yeshua is like Moshe, then he has to teach the commandments of Yahweh. He has to. Now, one reason, I don't think it's the only reason, but one reason that I brought out that Yeshua is worthy of more glory than Moshe is because Yeshua carried out those commandments that Yahweh put in his mouth flawlessly. He carried them out perfectly. He was tempted, Hebrews 4 verse 15, in all points just as we are, yet without sin. He is the anointed one of Yahweh who always loved righteousness and always hated lawlessness. That is why God, even your God, has anointed thee, Hebrews 1 says, with the oil of gladness above your companions. We're the companions, but Yeshua is anointed with the oil of gladness above us. So this is one reason he's worthy of more glory than Moshe. Yeshua is the center figure. Listen carefully now. This is where it's going to get a little bit deep. But listen carefully. I have full confidence in everybody here. Yeshua is the center figure on the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew chapter 17. And I think Mark chapter 9 and Luke chapter 9 are the parallels. Where the disciples saw a vision of the kingdom. They saw a vision of the kingdom, and all of a sudden, it says that Yeshua's face lit up, and it shone brightly like the sun. And also his garment was dazzling. And all of a sudden, they saw who with him? Moshe and Eliyahu. And I think that Moshe represents the law. Eliyahu represents the prophets. That could be here or there, but that's kind of how I see that. Well, when the disciples saw that vision, there was a cloud that came and covered where they were all at. I think it was 3 of the disciples, Peter, James, and John. And there was this voice that thundered, it says, from heaven. And the voice said, "This is my beloved Son. I take delight in him. Listen to him." The point I want to make here is that Yeshua is like Moshe in his close relationship with the Almighty, and specifically in the way that he teaches. That is the point of Deuteronomy 18. I will put my words into his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. Yahweh directly puts his words into the mouth of the Messiah, just like he directly put his words into the mouth of Prophet Moshe. This is why, brothers and sisters, this is why the law of Yahweh is called the law of Moshe throughout Scripture. Not just in the Older Testament, but also in the Newer Testament. As a matter of fact, I can show you, if you compare the author of Matthew and the author of Mark, Matthew 15 and Mark 7, you know the whole hand-washing chapter? Okay? You can compare them. One of the authors says, God said, honor your father and mother. The other author says, Moses said, honor your father and mother. So the words God and Moses are used interchangeably because of that close friendship and relationship that Yahweh and Moshe had. And this is the same reason that Yeshua can say, if you love me, keep my commandments. It's not that he has a different set of commandments than the Father, like the fellow I debated said. He doesn't have a different set of commandments. It's that he is authorized to teach with authority because Yahweh has directly downloaded his own words and commands into the mind and the heart of his anointed one, Yeshua of Nazareth. Now, look at Exodus 33. Exodus chapter 33, verses 7 through 11. It says, "Now Moshe took a tent and set it up outside the camp, far away from the camp. And he called it the tent of meeting. Anyone who wanted to consult Yahweh would go to the tent of meeting that was outside the camp." Now, I take that to mean they would go and consult Yahweh, meaning they talked to Prophet Moshe. Now, if we continue reading, you'll see why I say that. Verse 8. "Whenever Moshe went out to the tent, all the people would stand up, each one at the door of his tent, and they would watch Moshe until he entered the tent. When Moshe entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and remain at the entrance to the tent, and Yahweh would speak with Moshe. As all the people saw the pillar of cloud remaining at the entrance to the tent, they would stand up and then bow and worship, each one at the door of his tent. And Yahweh spoke with Moshe face to face, just as a man speaks with his friend." We'll get back to that phrase, face to face, here in a second. "Then Moshe would return to the camp, but his assistant, the young man Yehoshua, son of Nun, would not leave the inside of the tent." So, Exodus 33, 7 through 11, the text says that Yahweh would speak to Moshe like a man talks with his friend. Moshe would relay Yahweh's instructions to the people. And if the people tried to buck against Prophet Moshe, they would get in serious trouble. Turn from Exodus 33 to Numbers chapter 12. Let's go verses 5 through 9. So Miriam and Aaron have spoke against Moshe. And in verse 5 it says, Then Yahweh descended in a pillar of a cloud and stood at the entrance to the tent, and he summoned Aaron and Miriam. Now Aaron was the priest. Miriam was the sister of Aaron and Moshe. They're mentioned as both Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam are mentioned as leaders of the community. I think in the book of the prophet Micah, if I'm not mistaken. So these are top people here. But Yahweh says, Come here, Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them came forward, verse 6, he says, this is Yahweh speaking, he says, Listen to what I say. If there is a prophet among you from Yahweh, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moshe. He is faithful in all my household. I speak with him directly, openly, and not in riddles. He sees the form of Yahweh. So why were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moshe? And Yahweh's anger burned against them, and he left. And we find that Miriam was plagued with leprosy for speaking against Moshe. This shows the close communion Prophet Moshe had with the Most High, and how that speaking against Moshe was considered a grave error and sin. Now it's so intriguing. Back in Exodus 33, after the whole tent of meeting episode, in Exodus 33, Moshe has this encounter with Yahweh, and he asks Yahweh, Show me your glory. Can I see your glory? And Yahweh says, Okay. But he doesn't let him see his face. As a matter of fact, in Exodus 33, verse 20, Yahweh tells Moshe, he says, I'm going to hide you, right around verse 20, he says, I'm going to hide you in the crevice, a rock crevice here on the mountain. Remember, he's up there with Yahweh. Hide you in this rock crevice. He said, I'm going to put my hand over you. Sounds to me like Yahweh has a hand. And then he passes by, and then when he passes by, Yahweh takes his hand off of Moshe, and he says, you'll be able to see my back. That sounds to me like Yahweh has a back too. That's what it sounds like to me when I just read the text. Numbers 12 told us that Moshe sees the form of Yahweh, but he doesn't see the face, but he sees the back. He says, no man can see my face and live. Yet why are we told in Exodus 33 that he speaks with Moshe face to face? I think the harmony here, I think Exodus 33 is very clear that Yahweh said, nobody can see my face and live. So I think face to face is a figure of speech that means directly, and it can also be translated mouth to mouth, like a man speaks with his friend. It's like me sitting down and having a conversation with my friend, Brother Raymond. I think that's how Yahweh conversed with Moshe. But Moshe never saw the actual face of Yahweh, because he would have died upon seeing Yahweh's face. Now, look at Exodus 34, verse 29 through 35. And I'm going to read this carefully because I used to think that this text said one thing, but it actually doesn't say what I thought it said. Anybody ever found something like that? You've heard a text so long all your life, and you thought that it said one thing, but it actually doesn't say that. So I used to think that this text said that Moshe had put a veil over his face when he would talk to the Israelites because his face was too bright. But that's not what it says. So Exodus 34, verse 29, look at this. And Moshe descended from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands as he descended from the mountain. This is the second time that he's been up to the mountain. He already broke the first set of tablets back in Exodus 32 at the feast that Aaron proclaimed there, and they made the golden calf. Remember that? Okay? So Moshe breaks the first set of tablets. He goes back up. He fasts for another 40 days. No food, no water. A man that spends quiet time now draws close to Yahweh if he was to fast for 40 days. Moshe wasn't just fasting for 40 days. He was in the presence of Yahweh. He was being given the commandment stones. I mean, this is like righteous of the righteous. I mean, Prophet Moshe he's very, very high up in rank in Yahweh's kingdom. It says when he descended the mountain, this is the second time he descended, he did not realize that the skin of his face shone as a result of his speaking with Yahweh. This was in Exodus 33 where Yahweh passed by and proclaimed or pronounced his name to Prophet Moshe. But it caused his face to glow, to shine. Verse 30, when Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moshe, the skin of his face shone. They were afraid to come near him. But Moshe called out to them, so Aaron and all the leaders of the community returned to him, and Moshe spoke to them. Afterwards, all the Israelites came near, and he commanded them everything Yahweh had told him on Mount Sinai. He still hadn't put a veil on his face. The Israelites are looking at Moshe's face, and it's bright. Verse 33, when Moshe had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. So a lot of commentators think that what is going on here is that when Moshe was directly relaying the words of Yahweh to the community, he spoke open-faced. When he went about his own duties, he put a veil over his face, probably because, it's bright. Everybody don't want to go around the camp seeing a bright face all the time. But when he would speak with the authority of Yahweh, he would speak open-faced. Verse 34, but whenever Moshe went before Yahweh to speak with him, he would remove the veil until he came out. This was a recharge. He would go back to Yahweh, and he would be recharged and illuminated. And my JPS commentary on Exodus says that the words here, the verbal forms that are used to describe these activities, imply repetition of the actions, indicating that from the time that Moshe returned to the camp from Mount Sinai until his death, his face remained radiant. So every time he would go back to Yahweh, he would get recharged. And then he would go back down and he would speak the words of Yahweh to the people. They'd see that shining face of Prophet Moshe. The Israelites would see that Moshe's face was radiant, verse 35, and then Moshe would put the veil over his face again until he went to speak with Yahweh. The Septuagint text reads that the skin of his face was glorified while Elohim, or God, talked to him. Now, as I said, I used to think that Moshe covered his face with a veil when he spoke to the Israelites. That's not the case. I was wrong on that. If we slow down and read it, Moshe talked to the Israelites open-faced. Then he would go back and speak to Yahweh and get recharged and so forth and so on. They would see his shining face. Now, my point in bringing all of this up, it's very important, is that Moshe spoke with authority. He didn't say, listen to me because Abraham said this, or Enoch said this, or Shem said this. He said, listen to me because I've been in the presence of Yahweh. As a matter of fact, Moshe's face was Yahweh sharing some of his glory with his prophet. They were seeing the glory of Yahweh through the face of Prophet Moshe. He got it directly from the throne room. Nobody taught it to him. Yahweh directly gave it to him. Our Messiah is the same way. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 6 says this, for Elohim, God, who said, light shall shine out of darkness, he has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Yeshua, the Anointed One. The same way that the Israelites saw Yahweh's glory in Moshe's face, people saw Yahweh's glory in the face of Yeshua. And Yeshua's face even shone like the sun, according to Matthew 17 on the Mount of Transfiguration. But here's the point about the teaching. Yeshua did not appeal to previous scribes for authority. He was like Prophet Moshe. He got his message directly from the throne room. Catch this, when he would go out often to a deserted place to pray outside the camp, he was entering his tent of meeting. And Yahweh would come and speak with him. Then he would exit and he would teach the crowds what he had been told. This was not ordinary. Teachers of the law did not teach this way. And this is why the crowds were astonished when he spoke with authority and not like the scribes. Some of them probably thought, is this the prophet like Moshe? When we today as I close, when we today read the words of Yeshua, we are reading the words of Yahweh. When He speaks, Yahweh speaks. When we obey the Messiah, we're obeying Yahweh. All of this that we've went over in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 for all these weeks in this sermon is so important. Now, there are other things that our Messiah taught. I'm not saying that there aren't other things that he taught. But this sermon, I think, is the pinnacle of His teaching. It's the longest block of text where He just teaches. We should read it and we should study it over and over and over because it's Torah. Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is Torah. It's just as much Torah as Exodus 20 through 23. It's the Torah of Messiah, and by that I mean the Torah as explained and exegeted with authority by the promised Messiah. Receive it when you read it. Receive it as such. When you read the words of the Messiah, receive it as the law of Almighty Yahweh. May Yahweh bless you all in your studies and your practice of His law.